On the one Christmas that mattered most, my son answered the phone and told me I had the wrong house. Wrong house this year, Mum? I laughed. I thought it was a joke, the kind he used to make when he was 12, before life got serious. He didn't laugh back. And then, instead of hanging up, the call just stayed connected. For the next 4 minutes, I sat at my kitchen table in my coat, still buttoned from the cold, and listened to my son laugh in another room with people I couldn't see. I heard him say it, not to me, about me. She thinks the money she sends buys her a seat at the table. Someone else laughed harder than he did. A woman's voice, his mother-in-law maybe, agreed, like it was something they'd already discussed before, more than once. Like it was old news to everyone but me. I want to tell you I screamed into that phone. I didn't. I didn't cry either. Not yet. I just sat there, coffee going cold in front of me. I'd made 2 cups out of habit, the way I always do, though there's only ever been one of me to drink them. And I listened until the line finally clicked dead on its own. Then I did the only thing I've ever really known how to do when I've been blindsided. I opened my laptop. 30 years of accounting instinct doesn't disappear just because your heart's been handed to you on Christmas morning. Every transfer I'd ever set up for that family, automatic, recurring, quietly running in the background of both our lives for over a decade, I found. Every one of them still in my name, still mine to stop. By midnight I had. Not one of them remembered a certain note, still sitting in a courthouse file with my name on it, filed away so long ago that even I hadn't thought about it in years. They would. By morning, I had 25 missed calls. Before I tell you what I did next, you should know who spent 40 years becoming the woman on the other end of that call. My name is Christine Andrews. I'm 67 years old, and until that Christmas, I'd have told you I had made peace with my life. I live in Fairview, Ohio, in the same 4-bedroom house where I raised 2 children, mostly alone. It's modest, vinyl siding, a porch swing Robert built the year before he died, but paid for. Every board of it, paid for by me. Most mornings I walk 2 miles before the frost burns off the grass, in the same olive utility jacket I've worn for a decade now, the collar gone soft at the seams. My hair is copper and grey, braided back the way it's been since Robert used to say he liked it that way. I make coffee for 2 every morning. I always have. There's only ever been one of me to drink it. I built an accounting practice from nothing after Robert passed, working nights and weekends for 30 years, so my son Tyler would never know what it felt like to watch a bank account run dry the way I once had to. I never once told him that. I never wanted him to carry it. When he bought his house, I quietly wired $80,000 toward the down payment, a number he never mentioned to a single friend of his, as far as I know. When his children were born, I paid their private school tuition, semester after semester, for years, without so much as a card at Christmas. I told myself that was what mothers do. I told myself love doesn't need to be thanked to be real. She had spent 30 years making sure her son never knew what it felt like to struggle. She was about to find out he'd never once wondered how she avoided it. I built while they inherited. I saved while they spent. I worked while, somewhere along the way, they started performing a kind of success that was never entirely theirs to perform. None of that was resentment, not back then. It was just fact, the way a ledger is fact. Debits and credits. I knew exactly where every dollar I'd ever given had gone, because I'm the kind of woman who reads what she signs, who keeps the paperwork, who understands that a gift and a loan can look identical to everyone except the person who wrote the check. That habit, coffee for 2, was easy to explain away, the way she explained away everything else that followed. It started so small, I almost missed it. Thanksgiving, at Tyler's house. I arrived early to help, the way I always do, and found myself seated at the far end of the table when it was time to eat, past the gravy, past the good light from the fireplace. While his in-laws were settled into the chairs nearest the fire, the ones Tyler used to save for me. Nobody said anything unkind. Nobody had to. A seating chart can say plenty on its own. A few weeks later, I heard him telling a neighbour about the house, how he and his wife had managed it on their own, how proud they were of that. He didn't mention the $80,000. Not maliciously, I told myself, just an oversight. People forget things when they're excited. Then, in the kitchen after dinner one night, doing dishes I wasn't asked to do, I heard his wife on the phone with her sister. "Christine's allowance came through again this month," she said, laughing a little. Allowance. As if the tuition checks I'd written for years, the ones that kept 2 children in the kind of school Tyler and I had never dreamed of when he was young, were pocket money handed out to keep everyone comfortable. As if I was the one being subsidized, instead of the one doing the subsidizing. I told myself Tyler was busy. I told myself his wife's family simply did things differently than mine, that I shouldn't expect them to understand what our family's version of generosity looked like. I told myself I was tired, and tired people read too much into tone. I mentioned it to Marion over coffee one Tuesday. Marion, who's kept my books balanced through 2 divorces of her own and has never once minced a word in the 30 years I've known her. She didn't hesitate. "They don't think it's a gift anymore, Chris," she said, stirring her cup like it was nothing. "They think it's rent, and rent stops feeling like something you say thank you for." I laughed it off. I told her she was being dramatic, but I didn't forget it either. It sat there, the way things do when someone says out loud what you've been quietly avoiding. I might have gone on avoiding it a while longer, honestly, if Tyler hadn't called 2 days later, his voice a little too casual for the words that came out of his mouth. "Hey, let's just put the house title conversation on hold until after the holidays, okay? No rush." I hadn't known there was a house title conversation to begin with. I let the title comment go for almost 2 weeks. Then came the dinner, where I couldn't anymore. We were at Tyler's, the 6 of us around the table, the grandchildren already excused to watch something upstairs. His father-in-law, Gary, was talking about renovation plans the way men like Gary always talk about renovation plans. Loudly, with his hands, like the details had already been settled somewhere I hadn't been invited to. "Once the deed transfer clears," he said, reaching for the rolls, "we'll finally get that extra bedroom finished. Give the kids some real space." I set my fork down. "Whose name," I asked, "is on the deed transfer you're discussing?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The table went quiet in a way that told me everything before anyone answered. The particular silence of people realizing, all at once, that they'd been building plans on a foundation nobody had actually checked. Gary looked at his wife. His wife looked at Tyler's wife. Tyler's wife looked at Tyler. Tyler laughed, the way he does when he's uncomfortable, reaching for a joke to close the gap. "Come on, Mum. It's basically ours anyway. You know that." Basically ours. As if 30 years of documented transfers, of check numbers and dates, and my own signature on wire authorizations could be waved away with 2 words at a dinner table. The same way you'd wave away a joke that landed wrong. I didn't argue. I didn't correct him. I just looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable. The way you look at someone when you're deciding how much to say and how much to let sit. "Basically," I said, "isn't a word that shows up on a deed." Nobody laughed at that. Gary went back to his roles. Tyler's wife changed the subject to the kids' Christmas pageant. Too quickly. The way people change subjects when they'd rather not know the answer to the question they just heard asked. I drove home that night, with both hands steady on the wheel, thinking about how easily an entire family can build a future around an assumption nobody bothered to verify. and how long I'd let them go on believing it, mostly because correcting them had never once felt necessary before. It felt necessary now. My phone buzzed on the kitchen table before I'd even taken my coat off. A text notification, lighting up the screen face up beside my keys. It wasn't addressed to me, but it was about me.
I still hadn't taken my coat off. The message was from Tyler's wife, sent to a family group thread she must have meant to send somewhere else. A smaller thread, one that apparently didn't include me, except this time it did by accident, and I was standing in my kitchen reading words I was never supposed to see. Once the holidays are over, we just need her to sign the simplification paperwork. Easier if we frame it as protecting her, like what happened with her sister. She won't push back if it sounds like we're looking out for her instead of just moving the accounts into one we can actually see. I read it twice. The first time, I read it the way you read something that can't possibly mean what it seems to mean. The second time, I understood exactly what it meant, in the plainest terms there are. They intended to have me sign away my retained interest in the house. The interest tied to $80,000 I'd sent without a second thought. And fold whatever accounts I had left into something they could monitor. Not because they were worried about me, because it would be easier for them if I couldn't say no. And they intended to dress it up as care, as protection. The same way my sister's children had once talked about helping her, right up until there was very little left for her to make decisions about at all. I understood, reading that message, that the joke on Christmas morning hadn't been careless. It had been a rehearsal, a version, tried out on people who already agreed with the premise of how they intended to talk about me going forward. As someone confused, someone managed, someone whose seat at any table was provisional. I didn't cry over it, though I might have expected to. Mostly, I felt something settle into place, quiet and cold, the way water finds its level. I didn't call Tyler. I didn't call his wife. I set the phone down on the counter, face up, and I sat with it a while. The coffee I'd made, for two out of habit, going cold beside me, same as it had on Christmas morning. Then I made one call. Not to my son. To Diane Wu's office, my attorney, the one who'd handled small matters for me over the years, to confirm an appointment already sitting on both our calendars for an entirely different reason, one I'd nearly forgotten about myself. They believed her age made her someone to be managed. They had never once asked what her age had taught her. That appointment, it turned out, was not unrelated at all. 15 years ago, when Tyler and his wife bought their first house, I sat across from a much younger version of Diane Wu and told her I wanted to do this the right way. $80,000 is a lot of money to hand anyone, even your own son, without a piece of paper to show for it. I'd spent 30 years reading other people's ledgers, watching families come apart over exactly this kind of unspoken arrangement. A parent's help that everyone assumed was a gift until somebody's marriage ended, or somebody's memory started to go, or somebody simply decided to remember it differently than it had actually happened. So we drew it up properly. A documented loan, interest deferred, secured by a second lien on the property, recorded at the county courthouse the same week the house closed. Tyler signed it at the kitchen table without really reading it. The way you sign things when you're 29 and in a hurry and certain your mother would never actually do anything with a piece of paper like that. He wasn't wrong for 14 years. I never once mentioned it. Not when Marion made her comment about gifts turning into rent. Not when Gary talked about the deed transfer like it was already settled. Not even on Christmas morning, listening to myself get laughed about on a phone line no one remembered was still open. Correcting them had always felt petty, small, ugly, the kind of thing you do out of spite rather than principle. So I let it sit, quiet, functioning socially like a gift because that was easier for everyone, including me. It stopped feeling petty the moment I read that text. Diane pulled the file while I sat across from her, the same way I'd sat across from her 15 years earlier. She confirmed what I already knew in my bones, but needed to hear from someone else. The lien was still active, still recorded, still enforceable, exactly as written. Interest quietly accruing every year. Nobody thought to ask about it. She ran the numbers while I waited. $80,000 plus 15 years of deferred interest came to a figure considerably larger than anyone at that dinner table had any idea they were casually discussing as basically ours. I hadn't been secretly planning revenge for 15 years. I had simply been the only person in that family who read what she signed. "Do you want to call it due?" Diane asked, and I told her I wanted to know first whether I even still could. Whether time or circumstance had quietly worked against me the way it works against so many things people forget to check on. Confirm it's still enforceable, I told her. And tell me exactly what happens if I call it. Diane was quiet for a moment, pulling up something else on her screen, and it was in that pause, small, procedural, entirely unglamorous, that I first understood this wasn't going to be as simple as I'd hoped. It's still good, Diane said, turning her monitor slightly, so I could see the recorded lien myself, my own signature 15 years younger staring back at me. Recorded, enforceable, nothing's lapsed. But timing is going to matter more than the number does. I asked her what she meant. She explained it the way she explains everything. No drama in her voice, just facts laid out in order. If Tyler and his wife went ahead with that deed transfer conversation Gary had let slip, and folded it into a refinance of the mortgage, any new lender would take a senior position on the property. My lien, second in line for 15 years, could suddenly find itself behind new debt instead of just behind the original mortgage. Not erased, just weaker. Worth less in a fight, if it ever came to one. So the power here isn't dramatic, she said. It's a notice of default on the note, served properly, giving them a chance to cure it, pay what's owed. If they don't, we move toward a forced sale process to collect what the lien secures. It's not fast. It's not loud. But it's real. I sat with that for a moment. If I call the note due before they refinance, I asked, does my lien stay senior? Diane looked up at me properly then, the way you look at someone who's just asked the one question that actually matters, instead of the 10 questions most people ask around it. Yes, she said. As long as we move before any new mortgage records against the property, you keep your position. That's the whole game, honestly. Timing. I nodded. 30 years of reading ledgers teaches you that the number is rarely the interesting part of any transaction. The timing always is. There's something you should understand before we go further, Diane said, setting her pen down. Once we serve this, there's no quiet path back. They'll know exactly what you're holding, and exactly what it's worth. And there's a narrow window. Once they lock in a closing date for that refinance, we either move before it, or we lose the advantage entirely. A deadline then. One Tyler didn't know existed yet. One his in-laws certainly didn't know existed, still congratulating themselves over rolls and gravy about a bedroom that wasn't theirs to finish. Draft the notice, I told her. I'll let you know the moment I hear a closing date. I didn't have to wait long. They must have taken my silence for surrender. At a small gathering a few weeks later, nothing formal, just coffee and the kind of small talk that passes for family time these days, Gary announced, a little too pleased with himself, that the refinance was basically approved. Tyler's wife added, almost as an afterthought, in front of her own mother and a neighbor who'd wandered over, we're just waiting on Grandma to sign the simplification paperwork, and then we can really get moving. Grandma, as though the interest secured by a recorded lien on their property was a formality, waiting on an old woman's signature, rather than the other way around. As though my quiet, since that dinner, had been agreement instead of exactly what it was. The sound of someone reading the room correctly and choosing not to say so out loud yet. Nobody at that gathering knew there was anything to wait on except me. A week later, Tyler mentioned, almost proudly, that they'd locked in a closing date for the refinance. 3 weeks out, the paperwork already moving through the lender's pipeline. He said it the way you'd mention a vacation booked, a thing decided and settled, no longer up for discussion. I thanked him for letting me know. I meant it, in a way he couldn't have understood. The next morning, I drove to my bank, the same branch I've used for 30 years, and confirmed the certified mailing address on file, updating one small detail that had gone stale since we'd moved a mailbox years ago. An ordinary errand. The kind of thing nobody would think twice about, if anybody had been paying attention to what I did with my mornings, which by then, none of them were. Then I called Diane's office and asked her to have the notice of default ready, fully drafted, fully reviewed, waiting only for one thing. The moment you get that closing date in writing, she said, we serve it. I had it in writing within the hour. Tyler forwarded me the lender's confirmation email himself, cheerful, unthinking, certain he was simply keeping his mother informed. He had, without meaning to, handed me exactly what I needed. 3 weeks later, the closing date arrived. So did a certified letter. 2 days before the closing, the certified notice went out. 1 copy to Tyler, 1 copy, exactly as the recorded lien required, to the title company handling his refinance. Tyler called within the hour, his voice doing the thing it does when he's trying to sound calmer than he is. Mom, there's some kind of mistake. Some letter about a default. A lien. This has to be a mistake. You wouldn't actually do this. Not to family. I let him finish. I didn't correct him yet. Some things are better explained by paperwork than by mothers. The title company called him an hour after that, and this time there was no calm left in his voice at all. They wanted to know why there was an active, recorded lien on the property that hadn't been disclosed anywhere in the refinance application. A lien for $80,000, plus 15 years of accrued interest, held by a Christine Andrews. They wanted to know, politely but firmly, whether he'd known. He hadn't. Not really. Not in any way that had felt real to him until that moment. Diane fielded the follow-up call from the title company herself. And she told me later she'd never enjoyed a phone call less and understood one better. She confirmed in the plainest terms available to her that the lien was valid, properly recorded, and now formally called due in full. The refinance could not close over it. Not that day. Not until it was resolved one way or another. Tyler called me again that evening. I could hear something in his voice I hadn't heard directed at me in a very long time. Not anger exactly. Something closer to the sound of a man realizing the ground under him had never been quite what he assumed it was. Why didn't you ever tell me it was a loan? He said. All this time. Why would you let me think? You signed it, I said. 15 years ago, at my kitchen table. You just never read it. There wasn't much else to say, so I didn't say much else. You were right, I told him before he could find his footing again. It was never a gift you needed to thank me for. It was a loan you needed to pay back. They had expected pleading, if this day ever came at all, some tearful, apologetic version of me, easing quietly aside the way they'd already decided I would. Instead I brought documentation. They had expected me to ask permission before I did anything with what was mine. I had never once needed it. They had spent the last several months quietly deciding I was someone to be managed, gently moved out of the way of my own life. It turned out I had been standing on solid ground the entire time, recorded, dated, filed at the courthouse 15 years before any of them thought to wonder whether they should ask. There was no shouting. There didn't need to be. A closing had simply stopped, and a family was left holding paperwork they'd never bothered to read, wondering how it had ended up controlling all of them instead of the other way around. With the closing frozen, there was one more thing I needed to deliver. This time I decided it would be in person. Diane's office smelled like the same coffee it always has, and out of habit, pure old habit, nothing more, I'd stopped and bought 2 cups on my way in. I set one down in front of the empty chair beside me, the way I have for years, before I caught myself and almost laughed. There was no one to sit in that chair anymore. So I drank that one too. Tyler arrived a few minutes late, looking like a man who hadn't slept well and wasn't sure yet how the conversation was going to go. He sat across from me, Diane between us at the head of the table, and for a moment nobody said anything at all. I placed the folder on the table. Repayment terms, I said. For the note. Diane can walk you through the numbers, but they're fair. More than fair, honestly, given how long I let it sit. He nodded, slowly reaching for it. There's something else in there, I said, before his hand got there. Page 7. He stopped. I hadn't told anyone, not Tyler, not his wife, not even Diane until that morning, that I'd spent the last 2 weeks drawing up a separate document alongside the repayment terms. A restructuring of the education trust I'd set up years ago for my grandchildren, the one that had always quietly run through accounts Tyler and his wife could access on their behalf. The new version moved it entirely into my own name, my own control, disbursed directly for tuition and only tuition, with no intermediary and no discretion left for anyone but me. It wasn't punishment. I want to be clear about that, even now. It was simply the same instinct that had made me document the loan 15 years ago in the first place. Protecting something I cared about, without needing anyone's permission to do it. Page 7 first, I told Diane. She opened the folder to it, laid it flat on the table between us, and slid it toward Tyler. He read it slowly. I watched something shift in his face as he understood what it meant. Not that the money for his children was being taken away, exactly, but that it was no longer his to manage, or his wife's, or anyone's but mine. The house had never really been the point, not entirely. The point had always been this. Who gets to decide, going forward, how the things I've built are used to take care of the people I love? He didn't say anything for a long moment. He didn't reach for his coffee, either, untouched, going cold in front of him the way mine so often had. On so many mornings he'd never once thought to ask about. I'd already finished mine. Take some time with the repayment terms, I told him, standing gathering my coat. There's no rush. I've learned patience is something I have plenty of. I left the folder open to page 7 on the table between them, and I let myself out. Diane told me later that he sat there a long while after I'd gone, just looking at it, before he finally picked up a pen. Whether he signed both documents, or only one, or neither. That part of the story, I'll tell you another time.